"Sir, are you scared too?" The child's voice cut through the rhythmic clatter of steel wheels on frozen tracks. A question so unexpected that Galliano's carefully controlled breathing actually stuttered. He'd boarded this high-speed train specifically choosing the last car because it was empty, because men in his position didn't share space with civilians who might ask questions or remember faces. The overhead lights flickered as the train carved through December darkness, casting shadows across his tailored black suit and the silver watch that had cost more than most families spent on Christmas. But now, a small boy stood 3 feet away, red jacket brilliant against the train's gunmetal interior, a ridiculous lion-shaped winter hat perched on his head with one ear flopping forward. His cheeks were pink from the cold vestibule he'd apparently crossed to reach this isolated car, and he held a stuffed rabbit so worn its original color was a mystery, clutched against his chest like a talisman. Those brown eyes held no wariness, no survival instinct that should have told him not to approach men who radiated the kind of controlled danger Galliano knew he projected without effort. Galliano opened his mouth, but the words that should have come, a dismissal, a command to return to wherever he belonged, simply refused to form. The question itself had been loaded with an innocence so pure it felt like accusation, as if this child had somehow looked past the expensive clothes and controlled posture to see something Galliano had spent years ensuring remained invisible. Fear was weakness in his world, admission of vulnerability that could be exploited by enemies who watched for any crack in the armor. Yet this boy had asked as if fear were simply a shared human condition, something that connected rather than divided. The train swayed around a curve and the child moved closer, apparently interpreting Galliano's silence as permission, rather than the stunned paralysis it actually was. He climbed onto the seat directly beside him without hesitation, the stuffed rabbit positioned on his lap while small legs dangled several inches from the floor. Up close, Galliano could see the careful patches on the red jacket, the slightly too long sleeves that suggested hand-me-down or thrift store origin, the scuffed shoes that had been polished with effort, if not success. "I'm Seth," the boy announced, as if formal introductions were required before continuing this bizarre interaction. "This is Captain." He held up the rabbit briefly before returning it to protective custody against his chest. "Mommy's sleeping 3 cars that way because she worked a double shift, and the train made her finally stop moving." The explanation tumbled out in the uncomplicated way children shared information, no filtering for relevance or privacy. Galliano found himself glancing toward the connecting door through which this impossible child had emerged, half expecting an angry parent to appear demanding to know why a stranger hadn't immediately returned their wandering son. But the door remained closed, showing only darkness beyond its small window, and Seth continued sitting there, with absolute confidence that this was exactly where he belonged. The boy's fearlessness felt like indictment of Galliano's entire existence, a reminder that trust should be natural, rather than commodity to be carefully rationed. "Trains at night feel like moving through space," Seth continued, apparently comfortable with one-sided conversation. "Like we're not on Earth anymore, just floating between places that don't quite exist yet." His voice carried the dreamy quality of children who lived partially in imagination, who hadn't yet learned that reality offered no romance, only transaction and consequence. The observation was eerily poetic for a 6-year-old, suggesting a mother who read to him, who encouraged wonder even when exhausted from double shifts. Galliano's hands rested on his thighs, fingers that had signed documents ending rival operations, now uncertain what to do with themselves in proximity to this small, trusting presence. He should stand, walk the child back to his sleeping mother, return to the isolation that had served him well for longer than this boy had been alive. Instead, he heard himself asking, "Why aren't you scared?" The question emerged rough, unpracticed, because Galliano couldn't remember the last time he'd asked anything out of genuine curiosity, rather than strategic information gathering. Seth tilted his head, considering the question with seriousness that suggested he understood it wasn't really about fear of strangers. "Mommy says being scared is okay as long as you don't let it make you mean," he offered, swinging his legs slightly. "She says the bravest people are the ones who are scared, but do the thing anyway." The wisdom was clearly borrowed from his mother, repeated with the confidence of a child who believed completely in their parents' worldview. The train entered a stretch where houses dotted the landscape, windows glowing warm against the winter night like promises of normalcy Galliano had long since abandoned. Families sat around dinner tables in those houses, argued about homework and whose turn it was to take out trash, existed in the mundane friction of people who knew each other deeply enough to irritate and comfort in equal measure. His own penthouse stood dark and empty whenever he returned to it, cleaned by staff who arrived and departed on schedule, never leaving evidence of their presence beyond the absence of dust. "Do you have someone waiting for you?" Seth asked, apparently having completed his assessment and decided Galliano was safe enough for personal questions. "At wherever you're going." The innocence in the inquiry was devastating, because it assumed everyone had someone. That arrival meant greeting, rather than just another empty space in a different location. Captain the Rabbit stared at Galliano with one remaining button eye, accusatory witness to his inability to answer a child's simple question. Galliano felt something shift in his chest, a sensation so unfamiliar it took him a moment to identify it as the beginning of honesty trying to surface. "Business," he said finally, the word inadequate but familiar, the shield he'd used for years when people asked about his life. "Just business waiting." Seth nodded as if this made perfect sense, but his small face showed disappointment that suggested he'd hoped for a different answer, something involving people rather than transactions. The child adjusted Captain's position, careful with the worn toy in a way that spoke of having few possessions and treasuring each one. "We're going to see my grandma for the first time," he shared, voice dropping slightly. "Mommy's nervous because they didn't talk for a long time after I was born." The admission was delivered matter-of-factly, but Galliano recognized the weight behind it. Family rejection, bridges burned or at least severely damaged, a reunion that might heal or cause fresh wounds. Before Galliano could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal how closely that scenario echoed his own severed family connections, Seth added quietly, "She says Grandma might not like us because we're just us, because Mommy had me without being married, and we don't have the kind of life Grandma wanted for her." The boy's fingers tightened on the rabbit, first sign of vulnerability in his otherwise fearless presentation. "But Mommy also says sometimes people surprise you if you give them the chance." Galliano stared at this small philosopher in a lion hat, recognizing with uncomfortable clarity that he was supposed to be the one offering reassurance, adult wisdom to soothe the child's worry. Instead, he sat frozen by the accuracy of Seth's fear that being just us might not be enough, that the people who should love unconditionally might judge and find wanting instead. His own father had made that assessment years ago, pronouncing Galliano's chosen path as betrayal of family values, despite being built on the very violence his father had introduced him to. The train's rhythm changed slightly as it began climbing into mountain passes, and Seth leaned against the window to watch darkness rush by. "It's pretty when you can't see details," he observed, "just shapes and shadows and lights that could be anything." Galliano found himself looking too, seeing not the landscape, but the reflection of an unlikely pair, powerful man and trusting child, sharing space that should have remained empty. The image felt prophetic in a way he couldn't quite name, suggestion of possibility he'd stopped believing in. "Captain helps when I'm scared," Seth said, returning his attention to Galliano with the frank assessment only children managed. "What helps you?" The question was asked with genuine interest, no manipulation or judgment, just curiosity about how another human being navigated fear. It was possibly the most personal question anyone had asked Galliano in 5 years, and he had absolutely no answer that wouldn't reveal the truth. Nothing helped. He simply endured, existed in state of controlled tension that had become so constant he'd forgotten any other way of being. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Seth seemed content to wait, as if he had all the time in the world for Galliano to figure out how to respond. Outside, snow began falling, visible in the train's exterior lights, flakes that appeared and vanished in the same instant. The child watched them with delight, while Galliano watched the child, seeing wonder where he'd learned to see only precipitation that complicated travel and created operational difficulties. Seth's legs continued their gentle swinging, creating soft, rhythmic thumps against the seat that somehow made the isolation of the train car feel less absolute. He turned Captain to face Galliano, manipulating the rabbit's worn paw in a small wave that would have been absurd if it hadn't been so earnest. "He says you seem lonely," Seth announced with the confidence of someone translating for an authority figure. "Captain's good at noticing things like that because he's very old and has seen lots of people." Galliano felt his jaw tighten at the assessment delivered through a child's toy, the accuracy of it landing like physical blow. Lonely suggested lack, deficiency, emotional state he'd convinced himself was actually strategic isolation necessary for survival in his world. But sitting in this empty train car he'd chosen specifically to avoid human contact, hearing the observation from a 6-year-old who understood loneliness enough to name it, the distinction between chosen solitude and desperate isolation became impossible to maintain. "Your mother lets you talk to strangers on trains?" Galliano asked, deflecting with a question about parenting, rather than addressing Captain's devastatingly correct observation. His voice came out rougher than intended, rusty from the unfamiliar territory of honest conversation. Seth shrugged with the elaborate unconcern of children whose logic was still developing. "You're not strange, you're just sad," he corrected, as if this were obvious distinction. "Strange means weird or scary. Sad means your insides hurt." The train passed a small station without stopping, platform lights illuminating falling snow for a brief moment before darkness returned. Galliano watched Seth's profile as the boy tracked the lights, seeing none of the calculation or assessment that governed his own observations of surroundings. This child looked at the world as source of wonder rather than threat, saw people as potential connections rather than risks to be managed. When had Galliano lost that capacity, or had he ever possessed it in the first place? "Mommy says everyone has insides that hurt sometimes," Seth continued, apparently on a philosophical roll. "She says the difference between good people and bad people isn't whether it hurts, it's what they do about the hurt." He adjusted his lion hat, which had slipped forward over one eye. "Good people try not to hurt others just because they're hurting. Bad people spread it around like they're sharing." The borrowed wisdom from Carrie again, parenting through moral framework that acknowledged pain as universal while insisting on ethical response. Galliano found himself wanting to argue with a 6-year-old's simplistic view of morality, to explain that the world was far more complex than good people and bad people, that survival required actions that couldn't be color-coded so neatly. But Seth's brown eyes held such certainty, such faith in his mother's worldview, that Galliano couldn't bring himself to introduce the cynicism that had become his default lens. Let the child keep his uncomplicated ethics a while longer, before reality taught him the nuances that destroyed certainty. "Why do you sit alone if it makes you lonely?" Seth asked, pivoting back to his original observation with the persistence of children who latched onto interesting puzzles. "Aren't there other seats with other people who could talk to you?" The question revealed a mind that saw isolation as problem with obvious solution. Simply choose different seats, different company, different life. Galliano almost laughed at the innocence of believing change could be that simple. "I prefer spaces where no one asks questions," Galliano said finally, offering partial truth because this strange child seemed to pull honesty from him without effort. "Where silence doesn't require explanation." Seth absorbed this with a thoughtfulness that suggested he was trying to understand a completely foreign concept. His world was apparently full of questions and explanations, dialogue and connection. The idea of choosing silence must seem as strange as choosing to go hungry when food was available. "That sounds quiet but not peaceful," Seth observed after a moment, demonstrating emotional intelligence that exceeded his years. "Like when Mommy and I don't talk because we're mad, not because we're comfortable." He hugged Captain tighter, finding security in the worn rabbit that Galliano envied. "Mommy says silence is only good when you don't have to work at it, when you can just be quiet together and it feels okay." The train took a curve, and Seth leaned into it naturally, body adjusting to the motion with the ease of someone small enough that physics still felt like game, rather than forced to be managed. Galliano kept his own body rigidly controlled, resisting the sway, maintaining center of gravity through conscious effort. The contrast felt symbolic of something he couldn't quite articulate, child flowing with momentum, while the man fought every shift in foundation. "Do you know what my mommy says about trains?" Seth asked, apparently having an endless supply of maternal wisdom to share. "She says they're good for thinking because the movement does something to your brain that makes thoughts go different directions." He traced a meandering pattern in the air with one small finger, illustrating the concept. "Like your thoughts can go places they couldn't go if you were sitting still." Galliano realized with uncomfortable awareness that this was exactly what was happening. Thoughts that normally stayed contained behind well-maintained barriers were indeed going different directions, accessing memories and feelings he'd successfully suppressed through sheer force of will. Sitting still in his usual environments meant maintaining iron control, but something about the train's movement, the late hour, this impossible child's presence was indeed doing something to his thoughts, making them slip sideways into territory he normally defended against. "My mommy cries sometimes," Seth said suddenly, voice dropping to confidential whisper as if sharing important secret. "In the shower where she thinks I can't hear, but water doesn't cover sound as good as she thinks it does." The admission carried no melodrama, just factual observation tinged with concern. "I don't tell her I know because I think she needs to believe she's hiding it, that she's being strong for me." The observation was so mature, It made Galliano's chest tighten with recognition of parenthood's double burden, managing your own pain while performing strength for someone who depended on you completely. He knew that particular exhaustion, though in his case there was no child to protect, only an empire built on reputation of invulnerability. Seth's unnamed father was a fool for abandoning this boy, and the woman who'd raised him to be thoughtful about others' needs, even in his own fear. She works so hard, Seth continued, apparently having decided Galliano was safe repository for worries he couldn't share with his mother. 2 jobs, sometimes 3, and she always says she's fine, but her fine face looks different than her real happy face. His legs had stopped swinging, body gone still in a way that suggested he was accessing feelings he usually kept contained. I try to be good so she doesn't have to worry about me too, but sometimes I think that makes her sad in a different way. Galliano felt something crack in his carefully maintained emotional distance, fissure created by a child's articulation of trying to ease a parent's burden by erasing his own needs. He'd done the same thing as a boy, performed perfection for a father whose love came with conditions and scorecards. Seth deserved better than learning that particular lesson so young, deserved to know his needs mattered, even when his mother was exhausted from providing for them. Your mother is lucky to have you, Galliano heard himself say, words emerging without conscious decision to speak them. Anyone who works that hard to take care of someone loves them more than most people are capable of loving. Seth's face brightened at the validation, smile transforming his worried expression into something luminous. You think so? He asked hopefully, even though we're just us and don't have the regular kind of family? Especially because of that, Galliano said with unexpected certainty, thinking of the sprawling estate where he'd grown up surrounded by blood family who treated each other like business rivals. The regular kind of family isn't always the real kind. Seth nodded vigorously, apparently having found the reassurance he needed. That's what Mommy says too, he confirmed. She says we're a perfect family of 2, that more people would just be extra, not better. The train emerged from a stretch of forest into open farmland, lights from scattered houses creating constellation against the snowy landscape. Seth pressed his face against the window, breath fogging the glass while he traced patterns in the condensation. Do you think my grandma will like me? He asked quietly, vulnerability finally surfacing beneath his philosophical exterior. Mommy says yes, but her voice does this thing where it goes up at the end like she's asking a question instead of answering one. Galliano looked at this small, fierce, impossibly trusting child who'd wandered into an empty train car and somehow decided that a dangerous stranger was the right person to share his fears with. I think, he said carefully, weighing each word, that your grandmother would be a fool not to like you, and if she can't see what an extraordinary person you are, that's her loss, not yours. Seth turned from the window, eyes wide and hopeful. You really think I'm extraordinary? Everyone thinks their kid is extraordinary, Galliano amended, trying to retreat from the emotional exposure the statement had required. But Seth shook his head with the stubbornness of someone who knew when adults were backtracking. You don't have a kid, he pointed out with devastating accuracy. So you're just saying it because you mean it, not because you have to. The logic was irrefutable, and left Galliano with no defensive position, except silence. The boy returned his attention to Captain, adjusting the rabbit's position, with the careful tenderness that suggested the toy was far more than object. It was companion, confidant, extension of himself. Mommy gave me Captain when I was born, Seth explained without prompting. She says he's been on every adventure with me, that he knows all my secrets and keeps them safe. The rabbit's remaining button eye stared at Galliano, as if assessing his trustworthiness, determining whether he deserved inclusion in this small constellation of trust. Galliano found his gaze drawn to his own hands resting on his thighs, hands that had signed documents ending people's livelihoods, that had gripped weapons when signatures weren't sufficient. They were steady hands, controlled hands, the hands of someone who never showed uncertainty, because uncertainty meant death in his world. But sitting next to this child who radiated trust like heat, those same hands felt inadequate, ill-equipped for the kind of connection Seth offered so freely. You have very still hands, Seth observed, apparently tracking Galliano's attention. Most grown-ups fidget or move their hands when they talk, but yours just stay calm. The observation was delivered neutrally, but Galliano heard the unasked question beneath it. Why such rigid control? What was he defending against with that stillness? I learned to be still a long time ago, Galliano said, offering explanation that explained nothing. Movement gives away what you're thinking. Seth considered this with the seriousness he brought to all new information. Small face scrunched in concentration. "But isn't giving away what you're thinking how people understand each other?" he asked, locating the flaw in Galliano's logic with childlike directness. "If everyone hides what they think, how do you know who to trust?" The question was rhetorical philosophy from a 6-year-old, but it contained a truth Galliano had spent years refusing to acknowledge. That total control meant total isolation. "You trust people who've earned it," Galliano said, but even as words left his mouth, he recognized their inadequacy. Seth tilted his head, considering. "But how do they earn it if you never give them the chance?" he pressed. "Mommy says trust is like a garden. You have to plant seeds and water them and wait. You can't just expect flowers to appear because you decided to want them." More maternal wisdom, this time delivered with the confidence of someone who'd found the metaphor particularly compelling. The train's rhythm changed as it began descending from the mountain pass, subtle shift in pitch and tempo that both of them registered simultaneously. Seth's face brightened at the change, apparently finding meaning in the transition that Galliano couldn't access. "We're getting closer," the boy announced unnecessarily. "Closer to where things change." The phrasing was odd, suggesting not just physical arrival but existential shift, threshold being crossed that went beyond simple geography. "Are you scared about seeing your grandmother?" Galliano asked, redirecting conversation away from his own defensive patterns. Seth nodded slowly, honest in his admission. "A little," he confessed. "What if she looks at me and wishes I was different? What if she looks at Mommy and thinks she made a mistake having me?" The fear was articulated with the clarity of something he'd thought about extensively, worry that had been examined from multiple angles during those nights when his mother cried in the shower. Galliano felt anger spike at the unnamed grandmother who'd created this anxiety in a child, who'd allowed her judgment of her daughter's choices to cast shadow over this boy's sense of worth. "If she thinks your existence was a mistake, then she's the one who's wrong," he said with heat that surprised them both. "You're here, you're real, and anyone who can't see your value doesn't deserve access to you." Seth's eyes widened at the vehemence, but underneath the surprise, Galliano saw something like relief, validation from an unexpected source. "Mommy says her mom has old ideas about how families should look," Seth explained, apparently wanting to be fair despite his fear. "That she grew up when people did things in a certain order, and anything different seemed wrong." The generosity in trying to understand his grandmother's perspective while simultaneously fearing her rejection showed a capacity for empathy that made Galliano wonder what Seth could become if the world didn't crush that quality out of him. The passing landscape had shifted again, scattered farms giving way to more dense development as they approached whatever city marked Seth and his mother's destination. Lights were more frequent now, signs of human habitation multiplying, the isolation of the mountain pass dissolving into proximity to others. Galliano felt the transition like loss, knowing that arrival meant this strange interlude would end, that Seth would return to his sleeping mother, and Galliano would resume the solitary existence he'd chosen. "Do you ever wish you could go back and choose different?" Seth asked abruptly, apparently moving through his own thought process toward some conclusion. "Like, if you could be a kid again, would you pick a different way to be?" The question was asked with genuine curiosity, not as judgment, but as exploration of hypothetical possibilities. Galliano stared at this small philosopher, unsure how to explain that he'd never really had choices, that his path had been determined by circumstances and expectations, and survival instincts that kicked in before conscious decision was possible. "I think," Galliano said slowly, "that we become who we need to be based on what happens to us. Going back wouldn't help, because the same things would happen, and we'd make the same choices." Seth frowned at this, clearly dissatisfied with the deterministic worldview. "But Mommy says every day is a chance to choose different, that being stuck is something we do to ourselves, not something that happens to us." More borrowed wisdom, this time directly contradicting Galliano's fatalistic perspective. The conductor's voice crackled over the speaker system, announcing their approach to the next station in a bored monotone that suggested he'd made this announcement thousands of times. Seth perked up at the sound, checking the window as if expecting to see their destination materializing. "That's not our stop," he said after a moment, relaxing back into the seat. "We have 2 more. The clarification came with relief, suggesting he wasn't quite ready for this conversation to end despite knowing it must. Galliano found himself equally relieved by the reprieve, unsettled by his own reluctance to see this strange child leave. In less than an hour, Seth had created crack in Galliano's carefully maintained isolation, simply by existing without guile or agenda. The boy hadn't asked for anything except honest conversation, hadn't tried to manipulate or leverage or negotiate. He'd simply appeared with a question about fear and proceeded to dismantle Galliano's defenses through radical honesty and borrowed philosophical frameworks from a mother who sounded increasingly interesting. "Tell me about your business," Seth requested, apparently deciding that if they had 2 more stops he should gather more information. "What kind of work makes someone sit alone on trains?" The question was asked with innocent interest, no awareness that he was probing into territory that could be dangerous for both of them if answered truthfully. Galliano weighed his response, considering what truth he could offer that wouldn't burden a child with knowledge he shouldn't carry. "I manage family interests," Galliano said finally, using the phrase that technically wasn't a lie while obscuring the nature of those interests. "Make decisions about resources and territory, handle conflicts between different groups." Seth nodded as if this made perfect sense, apparently hearing nothing sinister in the vague description. "Do you like it?" he asked, cutting through professional description to the personal question beneath. "Does it make you happy?" The question landed with unexpected force, because no one had asked it in years, possibly ever. Success was measured in power and profit, in territories controlled and rivals eliminated, in respect maintained through calculated displays of strength. Happiness had never been part of the equation, was possibly antithetical to the kind of success Galliano had achieved. "It makes me successful," he said, offering the only answer he had. "That's what matters." Seth's small face showed confusion at the distinction, apparently unable to comprehend success that didn't include happiness as fundamental component. "Mommy always says she'd rather be happy than successful," he shared. "She says success is what other people see, but happiness is what you feel when no one's looking." The contrast to Galliano's worldview was stark. Carrie had apparently chosen authenticity over achievement, internal peace over external validation. He suspected she was both braver and wiser than his own choices had allowed him to become. The train entered a tunnel without warning, exterior lights disappearing as emergency lighting kicked in, casting the car in amber half-darkness that transformed familiar shapes into shadows. Seth moved closer instinctively, not touching, but closing the distance between them with the unconscious trust of someone who'd decided Galliano was safe. The tunnel's acoustics changed everything. The train's rhythm became louder, more insistent, sound bouncing off rock walls in ways that made conversation feel more intimate, confessional. "This is my favorite part of train rides," Seth whispered, as if the darkness demanded quieter voices. "When you go through tunnels and can't see outside anymore, just yourself reflected in the window." He pointed at the glass where their shapes appeared ghostly, overlapping with the amber emergency lights. "Mommy says tunnels are when you get to think about who you are, instead of where you're going." Galliano studied their reflection. Powerful man and small child, incongruous pairing that shouldn't exist, but somehow did in this suspended moment. His own face looked different in the distorted reflection, less controlled, more uncertain, as if the darkness stripped away layers he maintained in full light. Seth's lion hat appeared oversized in the reflection, making him seem even smaller, more vulnerable than he actually was in his fearless reality. "Why do you really sit in empty cars?" Seth asked again, his persistence undiminished by Galliano's earlier deflection. "And don't say because you like quiet, because I can tell that's not the whole truth." The observation came without accusation, just curiosity about why someone would choose isolation so deliberately. "My teacher says when people hide, it's usually because they're protecting something, not because they actually want to be alone." The tunnel stretched longer than Galliano expected, mountain passage that seemed to exist outside normal time and space. He felt the weight of Seth's question, the child's intuitive understanding that solitude and loneliness were not the same thing, that his carefully chosen isolation was defense mechanism rather than preference. "I sit alone," Galliano said slowly, "because in my world, letting people close means giving them power to hurt you. Distance is survival strategy." Seth absorbed this with the gravity it deserved, small face serious in the amber light. "But doesn't that mean you're already hurt?" he asked with devastating logic. "If you have to protect yourself all the time, aren't you living like you're already wounded even if no one's actually hurting you right now?" The question revealed an understanding of psychological self-protection that seemed impossibly sophisticated for 6 years old, making Galliano wonder what conversations Carrie had with her son during their family of two existence. "It's complicated," Galliano offered weakly, knowing the phrase was adult shorthand for, I don't want to explain, rather than genuine complexity. Seth nodded as if expecting this response. That's what grown-ups always say when they don't want to admit something's actually simple but scary, he observed. Mommy says complicated is usually just another word for scared to choose. The borrowed wisdom struck with surgical precision, cutting through Galliano's defensive complexity to expose the fear beneath. The train's sound changed, indicating they were approaching the tunnel's end, and Galliano felt something like panic at the thought of returning to normal light, normal distance, normal defenses. In this amber darkness, he'd somehow allowed himself to be seen by a child who asked questions adults had learned not to ask. What are you scared of? Seth pressed, apparently sensing the window of vulnerability closing. Not like scared of bears or heights, the real scared that makes you sit alone on trains. The question hung in the amber air while Galliano struggled with the unfamiliar impulse toward honesty. Years of carefully constructed lies and strategic omissions had made truth feel dangerous, exposure that could be weaponized by anyone paying attention. But Seth wasn't asking for strategic advantage. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to understand, because his small world still operated on the assumption that honest questions deserved honest answers. I'm scared, Galliano said quietly, words emerging from someplace he hadn't accessed in years, that if I let anyone see who I actually am underneath everything I've built, they'll realize there's nothing there worth knowing. The admission came out raw, unpolished, more truth than he'd intended to share. That the person I've become to survive has completely erased whoever I might have been if I'd made different choices. Seth's hand found his in the darkness, small fingers wrapping around Galliano's larger ones with pressure that was more reassurance than demand. You're here right now, the boy said with certainty that allowed no argument. Talking to me like a real person, saying true things even though they're scary to say. That means there's definitely something there. The logic was irrefutable, child's eye view that cut through existential anxiety with simple observation of present reality. The train burst from the tunnel into moonlit landscape, brightness after darkness making both of them blink against the sudden change. Seth's hand remained in Galliano's for a moment longer, before he withdrew it naturally, returning to holding Captain with both arms. The intimacy of the tunnel conversation seemed to hang in the brightened space, words that had been spoken in darkness now existing in light, whether either of them was ready for that exposure. My mommy cries in the shower, Seth said again, but this time with different emphasis, because she thinks if I see her scared, I'll be scared too. But I'm already scared sometimes, and pretending we're both not scared just means we're scared alone instead of scared together. His voice carried frustration with the isolation that adults impose through their protective instincts. I wish she'd just cry in front of me so I could hug her, and we could be sad together instead of separately. Galliano recognized the parallel Seth was drawing. That protective isolation, whether from child or from world at large, ultimately created more pain than it prevented. Carrie cried alone in the shower for the same reason Galliano sat alone on trains. Mistaken belief that acknowledging vulnerability meant burdening others with it. That strength required performing invulnerability even when exhausted from the effort. Have you told her that? Galliano asked. That you'd rather know she's sad than have her hide it? Seth shook his head, sudden shyness appearing for the first time in their conversation. I'm scared if I tell her I know, she'll feel bad that she didn't hide it better, he admitted. Like I'm criticizing her protecting instead of asking her to stop protecting. The ethical dilemma was sophisticated, not wanting to burden his mother with guilt about her attempt to protect him from her pain. Galliano wondered if Carrie understood what an extraordinary job she'd done, raising this thoughtful, emotionally intelligent child, despite her exhaustion and limited resources. Maybe, Galliano suggested carefully, people who love each other deserve to know the truth, even when the truth is painful. That pretending to be okay when you're not is a kind of distance that feels like protection, but is actually abandonment. The words were meant for Seth, but Galliano heard them ricochet back, applying to his own patterns of isolation, that he'd convinced himself were strategic, rather than fear-based. Seth considered this with his characteristic seriousness, working through the implications. So, if I tell Mommy I hear her crying and it's okay, that's not making it worse. It's making it more together? He asked, seeking confirmation of the framework. Even if it makes her feel bad at first that I knew all along? Galliano nodded, recognizing he was essentially advocating for vulnerability he couldn't practice in his own life, offering wisdom he'd never managed to embody. Your mother is lucky, Galliano repeated, meaning it more with each iteration. To have someone who wants to share her pain instead of just being protected from it. Seth's face showed relief at the validation, apparently having needed permission from an outside source to trust his instinct that honest connection was worth the discomfort. "I'll tell her," he decided. "After we see Grandma, when we're back home and things are normal again. I'll tell her I want us to be scared together instead of alone." The commitment was delivered with the certainty of someone who'd made important decision and intended to follow through. Galliano found himself hoping Seth would maintain that courage when faced with actual conversation, that childhood intention wouldn't dissolve into adult hesitation. "Promise you'll actually do it?" he heard himself ask, surprising them both. "Not just think about it, but really tell her?" Seth looked at him with new assessment, apparently recognizing that Galliano needed him to succeed where Galliano himself had failed. The connecting door burst open with force that suggested panic, rather than casual entry, and a woman stumbled through with the controlled desperation of someone who'd been searching multiple train cars. Her golden hair was disheveled from sleep and frantic movement, winter coat thrown over what appeared to be medical scrubs, and her face showed the particular terror of a parent who'd woken to find their child missing. "Seth," she gasped, eyes finding him immediately with the targeting system only mothers possessed. Carrie's gaze shifted to Galliano in the same instant, assessment changing from relief to wariness, as she registered her 6-year-old son sitting comfortably beside a man whose entire presentation screamed danger, the tailored suit that cost more than she probably earned in months. The controlled posture that suggested violence was always an option, the face that had been carefully arranged to reave. Nothing. She moved forward with determination despite obvious fear, positioning herself between Seth and Galliano with body language that declared willingness to fight if necessary. "I'm sorry," Galliano said immediately, standing and taking a step backward to create distance, hands visible and non-threatening. "He appeared about 40 minutes ago. I should have taken him back to you immediately." The formal apology was designed to de-escalate, to acknowledge his failure to follow basic protocol regarding lost children. But Seth was already scrambling from his seat, moving to his mother with Captain clutched against his chest. "Mommy, don't be mad," Seth said quickly, reading the mix of fear and anger in Carrie's expression. "I wasn't lost. I was exploring, and he's not scary. He's just sad like us." The child's hand found Carrie's, tugging gently as if he could physically transmit his certainty that no danger had existed in this encounter. "We were talking about being scared, and about Grandma, and about how people hide their real feelings." Carrie's eyes flickered with confusion at her son's characterization, still trying to reconcile the dangerous-looking stranger with Seth's complete lack of fear. She was beautiful in an exhausted way, the kind of beauty that persisted despite too many shifts and not enough sleep, bone structure that remained striking even when shadowed by chronic stress. Her hands showed recent scrubbing, nails short and practical, the hands of someone who worked with them constantly. A small silver pendant hung from a chain at her throat, catching light as she breathed too quickly. "I woke up and you were gone," Carrie said, voice shaking slightly as she pulled Seth closer, needing the physical confirmation that he was safe and whole. "I checked the bathroom, asked the conductor, started going car to car, thinking—" She didn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the horrors that had flashed through her mind during those minutes of searching. Her gaze returned to Galliano with mix of gratitude and suspicion, apparently unsure whether to thank him for not harming her son or condemn him for not immediately returning Seth to her. Galliano remained standing at careful distance, aware that his presence was now threat, rather than curious interlude Seth had experienced. "He's a remarkable child," Galliano offered, knowing the words were inadequate, but needing to say something that acknowledged what the past hour had meant. "You've done an extraordinary job raising him." Carrie's expression shifted at the compliment, defensive posture softening slightly as she registered the genuine respect in his tone. "He's not supposed to talk to strangers on trains," Carrie said, but her voice had lost its sharp edge, settling into something closer to resigned acknowledgement that Seth operated on his own logic. "We've had conversations about stranger danger, about not wandering off, about a dozen rules he apparently decided didn't apply tonight." Seth looked up at his mother with unrepentant affection, clearly understanding he was in trouble, but equally certain he'd made the right choice. "He asked if I was scared too," Galliano explained, feeling the need to justify how this encounter had happened, to help Carrie understand that Seth's fearlessness came from emotional intelligence rather than recklessness. The question was— He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound insane. "I didn't know how to respond, and by the time I figured out I should take him back to you, we were talking." and it felt wrong to interrupt that. Carrie's eyes held his with intensity that suggested she was reading layers beneath his words, seeing past the expensive suit to whatever truth existed underneath. "You really talked?" she asked, voice carrying doubt that any adult would genuinely engage with a 6-year-old stranger. "Not just humored him until you could get rid of him?" The question revealed her protective instinct paired with awareness that most people tolerated children rather than actually listening to them. "We really talked," Galliano confirmed, surprised by how much he meant it. About fear and loneliness and family, and the difference between being complicated and being scared to choose. Seth nodded vigorously at this summary, apparently pleased that Galliano had remembered their philosophical ground. "And about how Captain knows things," Seth added, holding up the worn rabbit as evidence. "And about Grandma and whether she'll like us." Carrie's face softened completely at the mention of her mother, tension releasing as she recognized that Seth had found someone to share his worries with, that this strange encounter had been about her son needing an outside perspective on the fears he couldn't fully share with her. "Oh, baby," she said, pulling Seth into a proper hug. "Grandma's going to love you. She's going to take one look at you and wonder how she stayed away this long." The certainty in her voice suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as Seth, but the love underneath the words was unmistakable. Galliano watched the embrace, seeing the way Seth melted into his mother's arms despite his earlier philosophical detachment, seeing the way Carrie's whole body relaxed once she had her child physically close. The bond between them was palpable, tested by circumstances but fundamentally unshakable. "Should I go back to our seats now?" Seth asked, though his tone suggested he was hoping for a different answer, that he wanted this strange three-way encounter to continue somehow. Carrie looked at Galliano, then at the empty seats around them, then back at her son, who was clearly not ready to leave. "We could," she started, then stopped, apparently struggling with competing instincts. Remove Seth from the stranger immediately, versus honor her son's obvious connection to this unlikely person. "Sit," Galliano said, gesturing to the seats with sudden decisiveness born from not wanting this to end yet, not wanting to return immediately to isolation after tasting something different. "Please, if you're comfortable. He hesitated, unsure how to finish that sentence. What was he? Sorry? Grateful? Changed by an hour of conversation with a child? "I'd like to hear more about this grandmother visit, if you're willing to share." Carrie studied him for a long moment, weighing risk against the intuitive sense that sometimes strangers could be trusted, despite all logical arguments against it. She saw something in his face that must have satisfied her assessment, because she nodded slowly, removing her coat and settling into the seat across from where Galliano had been sitting. Seth immediately positioned himself between them, creating a bridge with his small body, apparently determined to maintain connection between the two adults. "My mother and I haven't spoken in 6 years, Carrie said abruptly, apparently deciding that if they were doing this, they might as well do it honestly. "Since I told her I was pregnant and keeping the baby despite not being married, despite the father making it clear he wanted no part of parenthood." Her voice carried no self-pity, just factual recitation of history that had shaped her present. "She said I was throwing my life away, that I'd regret choosing a child over stability and respectability." Galliano leaned forward slightly, drawn in by the vulnerability of her admission. "But you didn't regret it," he stated, rather than asked, seeing the evidence of that choice sitting between them, bright-eyed and wrapped in a lion hat. Carrie smiled at Seth with such fierce love it was almost painful to witness. "Not for 1 second, she confirmed. "Hardest thing I've ever done, and also the best thing. But I'd be lying if I said there weren't moments I wondered what my life would look like if I'd made the choice she wanted." Seth's hand found his mother's, small fingers weaving through hers with practiced ease. "Mommy says she won the lottery when she got me," he informed Galliano seriously, "even though we're actually poor and can't afford lottery tickets." The observation would have been funny if it weren't so poignant. 6-year-old understanding of financial struggle wrapped in absolute certainty of being loved. Carrie laughed, the sound surprising all of them with its genuine warmth. "That's exactly right," she confirmed, squeezing Seth's hand. "Best return on investment in the history of investments, even if the investment was accidental and completely unplanned." She looked at Galliano with new directness, apparently having decided he'd earned more of her story. "My mother wrote me a letter last month, first contact in 6 years, said she'd been wrong, that she wanted to meet her grandson, that she'd wasted too much time on pride and principles when she should have been learning who we actually are." The train's rhythm had become white noise, backdrop to the conversation happening in seats that minutes ago had held only one isolated person, and now contained an impromptu gathering of damaged people trying to be brave. Carrie shifted her position, tucking one leg underneath her with the unconscious comfort of someone who'd become used to making any space feel temporary and homelike. Her exhaustion was visible in the shadows beneath her eyes, but animation of talking about her life seemed to energize her beyond what rest could provide. Part of me wants to believe her letter was genuine, Carrie continued, fingers still intertwined with Seth's in her lap. That she really has changed. That she actually wants to know Seth instead of just checking a grandmother box before she gets too old to make the effort. The skepticism was earned rather than cynical, protective instinct, born from having been rejected once, and refusing to let her son experience the same disappointment. But the other part remembers how certain she was that I was ruining my life, how clear she made it that choosing Seth meant choosing him over her. Galliano understood family ultimatums that forced impossible choices, fathers who demanded absolute loyalty or complete severance with no middle ground permitted. "What made you decide to go?" he asked, genuinely curious about what could overcome that kind of foundational hurt. After 6 years of silence, what made her letter different from staying angry? The question felt intrusive even as he asked it, but Carrie didn't seem offended by the directness, apparently finding relief in someone asking what she'd probably been asking herself. Seth deserves the chance to know his grandmother even if that relationship ends up disappointing him, Carrie said after a moment, voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd thought through every angle of a decision until thinking became its own form of torture. I can survive her rejecting me again. I've already done that once. But if I keep him from her out of my own hurt, and someday he resents me for that choice, I'd never forgive myself. The maternal sacrifice was evident in every word, willingness to risk reopening her own wounds to give Seth an opportunity she wasn't certain would be positive. Seth had been quiet during this exchange, listening with the careful attention children gave to conversations about themselves that adults thought were happening over their heads. "I'm not scared she won't like me," he clarified suddenly, apparently needing to correct the assumption everyone had been making. "I'm scared she'll like me, but still not like Mommy, and then I'll have to choose." The fear was articulated with precision that suggested he'd been sitting with this particular anxiety for longer than the train ride. The observation landed heavily between all three of them, revealing the complexity of the situation in a way that adult conversation had been dancing around. Carrie's face showed surprise and pain at her son's worry, apparently not having considered that Seth might fear being forced into picking sides. "Baby, you would never have to choose between us," she said firmly, pulling him closer. "Whatever happens with Grandma, you and I are a team. Nobody gets to split that up. But what if she wants me to stay with her, and you want us to go home?" Seth persisted, working through the scenario with the logical progression children used when trying to map out all possible outcomes. What if she says she'll help, but only if we move there, and you don't want to move? The questions revealed he'd been listening to conversations Carrie thought she'd had privately, picking up on tensions and possibilities from overheard phone calls or his mother's worried midnight pacing. Galliano watched Carrie struggle with how to respond, seeing her mental calculation of what truths to share versus what protection to offer. "We're not moving," she said finally, choosing honesty. "Our life is in our city, my job, your school, our apartment that's small but ours. Grandma can be part of our life if she wants, but she doesn't get to rewrite the whole story just because she decided to show up late." The firmness in her voice seemed to reassure Seth, who relaxed slightly against her side. "Your mother's brave," Galliano said to Seth, but his eyes were on Carrie. "Taking you to meet her mother despite knowing it might go badly, maintaining your home and life while leaving door open for reconciliation, that takes more strength than most people have." Carrie's cheeks colored slightly at the compliment, apparently unused to having her parenting choices validated by strangers, especially strangers who looked like they'd never had to choose between rent and groceries. "I'm terrified," Carrie admitted with a laugh that held no humor. "Absolutely terrified that she'll say something that hurts Seth, or that she'll pretend to be interested in him, but I'll be able to tell she's judging us, or that she'll be genuinely wonderful, and I'll resent her for not being wonderful 6 years ago when I desperately needed a mother." The admission tumbled out with momentum of confession too long held inside, words that apparently needed to be spoken even to a stranger on a train. Seth patted his mother's hand with the comforting gesture of someone much older, having clearly reversed their roles in this moment. "Captain says it'll be okay either way," he announced with the certainty of someone relaying information from a higher authority. He says Grandma is just another person who might surprise us, and if she doesn't, we'll still have each other. The wisdom filtered through a stuffed rabbit somehow carried more weight than if stated directly, child's logic that allowed difficult truths to land softly. Captain is very wise, Galliano agreed seriously, giving the rabbit the respect it clearly deserved in this small family's constellation. Has he been giving you this kind of advice for long? Seth nodded enthusiastically, apparently delighted to have another adult who understood Captain's importance. Since I was born, he confirmed. Mommy says he's absorbed all her best parenting, so now he can remind me of it even when she's too tired to remember herself. Carrie smiled at this characterization, some of the tension leaving her shoulders as the conversation shifted to lighter territory. Captain's my backup brain, she confirmed. When I'm working double shifts and running on 4 hours of sleep, he steps in to make sure Seth remembers that he's loved and capable, and that chocolate milk before bed is not an acceptable dinner. The shared mythology around the worn rabbit revealed the creativity she'd employed in single parenting, making necessity into magic through storytelling and imagination. Do you have a captain? Seth asked Galliano suddenly, apparently having decided that everyone needed their own version of emotional support and wisdom. Someone who reminds you of important things when you forget? The question was asked with genuine interest, no awareness that he was probing into territory Galliano had spent years avoiding. Or, do you just remember everything yourself? Galliano felt the weight of the question, the assumption that everyone had someone or something that anchored them emotionally. I used to, he said carefully, surprising himself with the admission. A long time ago, but I lost track of those reminders, forgot what was important outside of work and success and maintaining control. The vagueness was intentional, but the truth underneath was more honest than he'd been with anyone in years, that he'd systematically eliminated anything that might make him vulnerable or soft or human in ways his position couldn't afford. Carrie's eyes held understanding that suggested she recognized emotional amputation when she saw it, probably having treated enough patients to know what people looked like when they'd cut off parts of themselves to survive. It's not too late to remember, she said quietly, the statement neither judgment nor platitude but simple observation. People forget things and then remember them again all the time. That's what growing up is, I think. Forgetting what matters and then fighting to remember it again. The conductor's voice crackled through the speakers again, announcing the next station with the same bored intonation that suggested nothing on this train ride was remarkable or life-changing. Seth tensed slightly at the announcement, checking the window for landmarks that would tell him whether this was their stop. One more after this, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. One more and then everything changes. The phrase echoed his earlier observation about getting closer to where things change. Temporal awareness unusual in someone so young. Are you ready? Galliano asked, directing the question at both mother and son. Carrie laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement at the absurdity of the question. Absolutely not, she admitted. But I don't think ready is actually the requirement here. I think showing up is the requirement, and ready is something you discover you are after you've already done the thing. The philosophy matched her earlier assertions about courage being action despite fear, rather than absence of it. Seth nodded agreement with his mother's assessment, apparently having already internalized her worldview about bravery. Mommy says you can't wait until you're not scared to do scary things because then you'd never do anything important, he shared. She says scared means it matters, and if it matters, you do it even when your stomach feels funny and your hands shake. The borrowed wisdom was delivered with the confidence of someone who'd watched his mother live by these principles, rather than just talk about them. Galliano recognized in that moment that this accidental encounter on a train had revealed to him what he'd been missing, not specific people or relationships, but an entire framework for existing that he'd abandoned somewhere along the path to power. Carrie and Seth lived with fear as constant companion, acknowledged it, and moved forward anyway, found courage not in absence of vulnerability, but in choosing connection despite it. They were poor and uncertain, and facing family reunion that might wound them further, but they had each other, and philosophy of being scared together rather than alone, and somehow that seemed more valuable than anything Galliano had accumulated through his carefully controlled existence. The train slowed as it approached the penultimate station, brakes engaging with a subtle shift in momentum that all three of them registered simultaneously. Passengers in other cars would be gathering belongings, checking tickets, preparing for arrival. But in this last car, the three of them remained still, suspended in a conversation that felt too important to interrupt with practical concerns. Seth had repositioned himself so he was leaning against both his mother and Galliano simultaneously, creating physical bridge between them with his small body in a way that felt both innocent and intentional. Carrie glanced out the window at the station platform sliding past, lights illuminating travelers waiting for northbound trains, families reuniting with embraces and laughter. "I used to watch people at stations and airports," she said quietly, "back when I was pregnant and terrified, and I'd try to guess their stories. Happy reunions, sad departures, business travelers who did this so often it lost all meaning." Her voice carried the distance of memory, remembering a younger version of herself trying to find hope in strangers' narratives. "I'd tell myself that someday Seth and I would be one of those happy reunion families, that someone would be excited to see us arrive." The train lurched slightly as it pulled away from the station, continuing toward their final destination. Galliano watched Carrie's profile as she stared out the window, seeing the vulnerability she was allowing him to witness, the way she'd somehow decided he was safe enough to hold these confessions. "Your mother will be excited to see you arrive," he said with more certainty than he felt, offering the reassurance she clearly needed. "Or she's an idiot who doesn't deserve either of you, and you'll know that definitively instead of wondering." Seth tilted his head back to look up at Galliano, eyes serious in a way that suggested he was about to say something important. "What if you came with us?" he asked, the question delivered with such innocent hope it physically hurt. "Not to meet Grandma, but just to the station, so you could see us arrive and know we're okay?" Carrie's eyes widened at her son's suggestion, clearly not having expected him to extend their temporary connection beyond the train ride itself. "Seth, honey, he has his own business to get to," Carrie said gently, giving Galliano an out from what was clearly an impossible request. "He's been kind to talk with us, but everyone has their own destinations." But even as she said it, Galliano saw something in her expression, a flicker of hope that maybe he wouldn't take the easy exit, that maybe this strange connection could extend just a bit longer into uncertain territory outside the train's contained space. Galliano felt the weight of the invitation, the magnitude of what Seth was actually asking, not just physical presence at a station, but willingness to care about their outcome, to invest emotionally in strangers he'd met by accident. Everything in his carefully constructed life argued for polite refusal, for maintaining boundaries that had protected him from exactly this kind of entanglement. But sitting there with Seth's warmth against his side, and Carrie's vulnerable hope in her eyes, those boundaries felt less like protection and more like prison. "My business can wait," Galliano heard himself say, words emerging before conscious decision had been made. "If you're comfortable with it, I'd like to see you safely to wherever you're meeting your mother." The offer hung in the air between them, more significant than the simple logistics it described. He was offering presence, witness, the kind of showing up that people in his world didn't do, because it implied caring about outcomes beyond their own advantage. Carrie's expression cycled through surprise, uncertainty, and something that might have been relief so profound it was painful to witness. "You don't have to," she said, but her voice lacked conviction, revealing that she desperately wanted him to insist. "I mean, we'll be fine. We've been fine on our own for 6 years. We can handle one more arrival." The assertion of independence was automatic, practiced defense against disappointment, but underneath it, Galliano heard the exhaustion of someone who'd been handling everything alone for too long. "I know you'll be fine," Galliano said, meeting her eyes with directness that allowed no misinterpretation. But fine and alone isn't the same as fine with someone who cares about the outcome, even if that someone is a stranger you met on a train. Seth made a small sound of satisfaction, apparently pleased that his impossible request had somehow been granted. Captain the Rabbit was adjusted to face Galliano, as if in approval of this development. The train's speed increased again, eating up the remaining distance between present moment and imminent arrival. Galliano felt something shifting in his chest, a sensation he couldn't quite name but recognized as significant, like ice that had been frozen so long he'd forgotten it was just water that could thaw and move again. Seth and Carrie had done something to him in the space of an hour, cracked open defenses he'd thought were permanent architecture, rather than temporary shelter he'd forgotten to leave. "Can I ask you something?" Carrie said, voice tentative in a way that suggested the question was personal. "What kind of business are you in that makes you sit alone on trains looking like—" She paused, searching for words that wouldn't offend, like someone who's been to war and won but wishes they'd found another way to fight. The observation was eerily accurate. Seeing past his controlled exterior to the exhaustion and regret he thought he'd hidden successfully. Galliano considered various versions of truth he could offer, the sanitized explanations that technically weren't lies, but obscured more than they revealed. But after an hour of Seth's relentless honesty and Carrie's brave vulnerability, deflection felt like betrayal of something fragile they'd built together. "I manage my family's interests," he said carefully, which is polite way of saying I run operations that exist in spaces where law and business blur together. I make decisions that protect our territory and hurt people who threaten what we've built. The admission hung heavy in the train car, words that should have sent Carrie grabbing Seth and running to find a conductor, reporting dangerous man in the last car who'd just confessed to criminal enterprise. Instead, she held his gaze with steady assessment, apparently weighing what he'd said against how he'd been with her son, measuring danger against the unexpected gentleness he'd shown. "Organized crime?" she asked bluntly, apparently deciding direct questioning was preferable to polite euphemism. "That's one term for it," Galliano confirmed, refusing to soften the reality with better language. "Though we prefer to think of it as providing services in markets that traditional business won't touch. But yes, the world I operate in involves violence and intimidation, and things that would horrify you if you knew the details." He waited for her to pull away, to gather Seth and leave, to recognize the threat he actually represented to their safe, moral universe. But Carrie didn't move, didn't grab Seth or flee, just sat there processing information with the clinical assessment of someone who'd seen enough in emergency rooms to know that danger wore many faces, and goodness was sometimes found in unlikely places. "And tonight?" she asked quietly. "Sitting alone on a train, letting my son interrogate you for an hour, offering to see us safely to our destination. Which version of you is that?" "That's the version I thought I'd killed off years ago," Galliano admitted, surprised by his own honesty. "The part of me that still remembers what it felt like to care about something beyond power and control and winning. Your son asked if I was scared too, and the truth is, I'm terrified of what happens if I let myself remember how to be human, instead of just effective." The confession was more vulnerable than anything he'd shared in years, exposure that made him feel stripped raw. Seth had been quiet during this exchange, listening with the gravity children brought to adult conversations about things they only partially understood. "Mommy says people aren't just one thing," he offered into the silence. "That everyone has the person they are and the person they could be, and sometimes those are different people." He looked up at Galliano with those trusting brown eyes. "Maybe you're both versions at the same time, and you get to pick which one is in charge." The philosophical offering from a 6-year-old landed with unexpected force, suggesting that identity wasn't fixed, but choice made repeatedly, that past actions didn't permanently determine future possibilities. Galliano wanted to argue that it was more complicated than that certain lines once crossed couldn't be uncrossed, certain choices accumulated into identity that became destiny. But looking at Seth's certain face and Carrie's hopeful expression, he wondered if maybe the child's simple framework was more accurate than his own fatalistic complexity. "The version of me that wants to make sure you arrive safely is in charge right now," Galliano said finally, accepting the gift Seth was offering, permission to be different than he'd been, even if just for this moment. "Whatever I am the rest of the time can wait until after I know you've met your grandmother and have somewhere safe to go if things don't work out the way you're hoping." The commitment was spoken aloud, witnessed, making it real in a way that private decisions never were. The overhead lights flickered as the train passed through another brief tunnel, momentary darkness that felt symbolic of transition they were all experiencing. Galliano noticed his hands had relaxed on his thighs, fingers no longer maintaining the rigid control that had been his default for years, as if Seth's presence had somehow given him permission to exist without constant defensive tension. Carrie was watching him with an expression that suggested she was seeing past his expensive suit to something more fundamental, the way medical professionals learn to see beneath symptoms to underlying conditions. "You know what's interesting?" she said suddenly. "In the ER, I can always tell the difference between people who are alone by circumstance and people who are alone by choice. The first group wants company but doesn't know how to ask. The second group has forgotten why they started choosing isolation in the first place." Galliano felt the observation land with uncomfortable accuracy, recognizing himself in the second category, but unsure which version he actually wanted to be. "And which one do you think I am?" he asked, genuinely curious about her professional assessment applied to his personal situation. Carrie tilted her head, considering him with the same careful attention she probably gave to patients presenting with unclear symptoms. "I think you started as the second and became the first without noticing the transition," she said slowly. "I think you built such an effective fortress that by the time you realized you were lonely inside it, You'd forgotten how to open the gates without dismantling the whole structure. And dismantling it feels like dying, so you just stay inside and tell yourself it's what you chose. The accuracy of her diagnosis was both validating and terrifying. Someone who'd known him less than 2 hours articulating truths he'd been avoiding for years. Carrie's eyes glistened with tears. She was clearly trying not to let fall, apparently undone by the kindness from a stranger who'd just admitted to being exactly the kind of person she should protect her son from. "Thank you," she said simply, the 2 words carrying weight that encompassed more than just the practical offer. She was thanking him for seeing them, for treating Seth like someone worth listening to, for being honest about his darkness instead of pretending it didn't exist, for choosing to show up despite having every reason to stay isolated. The train's rhythm was changing again. Subtle shifts that suggested arrival was imminent rather than theoretical. Seth scrambled to the window, pressing his face against the glass to watch for landmarks that would indicate their station. "I see lights," he announced. "Lots of lights. Bigger than the other stations." His excitement was visible in the way his whole body vibrated with energy. Earlier fear apparently transformed into anticipation through the alchemy of having support and facing the unknown. Galliano stood, stretching muscles that had been still too long, preparing himself for whatever came next. He pulled his phone from his pocket, checking messages he'd been ignoring for the past hour, seeing the usual urgency from his organization about decisions needed and situations requiring his attention. All of it could wait, would have to wait, because for the first time in recent memory he'd found something that mattered more than maintaining his empire's daily operations. He silenced the phone completely, choosing presence over power. The train's final approach was marked by gradual deceleration, industrial outskirts giving way to more urban landscape as they entered the station's territory. Seth remained at the window, narrating observations with the breathless enthusiasm of someone for whom train travel was still adventure, rather than tedious necessity. "There's a big clock tower," he reported, "and people with suitcases everywhere, and lights that are red and green and yellow like Christmas but all year." His voice carried wonder that made even mundane station architecture sound magical through his interpretation. Carrie gathered their minimal belongings. A small duffel bag that had been tucked under the seat, Seth's backpack decorated with cartoon characters, her own worn purse that had seen better years. The poverty evident in their few possessions made Galliano's designer luggage feel obscene by comparison, visible reminder of the vastly different worlds they inhabited. He'd spent more on his watch than Carrie probably earned in a year, yet somehow her life seemed richer, more meaningful, filled with connection he'd traded for material comfort. "Do you want to freshen up before we arrive?" Galliano asked Carrie, recognizing she'd woken from sleep to search for Seth and hadn't had opportunity to prepare for meeting her estranged mother. She touched her hair self-consciously, apparently only now remembering she was about to face someone who would judge her appearance along with everything else. "I must look awful," she said, more statement than question. "Hospital scrubs and train hair. Exactly the impression I wanted to make after 6 years." Seth turned from the window to assess his mother with the frank honesty only children managed. "You look like you," he declared, as if this settled the matter completely. "Grandma can like how you actually look or not like it, but pretending to be different wouldn't work anyway because you're not good at pretending." The observation was delivered without malice, just factual assessment of his mother's transparent nature. Carrie laughed despite her obvious nervousness, pulling Seth close for a quick hug. "Out of the mouths of babes," she murmured, apparently accepting her son's wisdom that authenticity was the only viable strategy. She did run fingers through her golden hair, attempting to impose some order on sleep-tousled waves, but made no move toward the bathroom to attempt more comprehensive transformation. "If she can't handle seeing me exhausted from working double shifts to support the grandson she abandoned, that tells me everything I need to know about whether this reconciliation is real." The train slid into the station with practiced precision, platform lights flooding through the windows and illuminating their small group with unforgiving brightness. Other passengers in forward cars were already standing, forming lines in aisles, eager to disembark and reach whatever destinations or reunions awaited them. But Carrie, Seth, and Galliano remained seated for a moment longer, as if by silent agreement that rushing would break something fragile they'd constructed during the journey. "Last chance to change your mind about coming with us," Carrie said to Galliano, offering the exit she'd promised, even as her expression showed hope he wouldn't take it. "No judgment if you've realized this is too weird, too complicated, too much involvement in strangers' messy family drama. The words were generous, even as they revealed her own vulnerability. The fear that he'd realize what he'd offered in the train's intimacy seemed absurd in the harsh light of normal reality. Galliano stood, reaching for his bag with movements that were decisive rather than hesitant. "I said I'd see you safely to your destination, and I meant it," he replied, with firmness that allowed no room for reconsideration. "Unless you've changed your mind about wanting a stranger present for your family reunion?" He made the question light, offering her the same out she'd offered him, ensuring this remained choice rather than obligation. "Having a witness seems smart, actually," Carrie said, standing and helping Seth into his backpack. "Someone who's not emotionally invested can see things more clearly than people caught up in old patterns." The practical reasoning was clearly rationalization for wanting support, but Galliano didn't challenge it, accepting whatever justification allowed her to let him stay. Seth was already moving toward the door, eager to begin whatever came next, now that delay was no longer option. They disembarked into the controlled chaos of a major station at night, announcements echoing from speakers, travelers moving in purposeful streams toward exits or connecting trains, the particular energy of transition space, where everyone was between one place and another. Seth's hand found Galliano's automatically, small fingers wrapping around two of his larger ones with pressure that communicated both excitement and nervousness. Carrie noticed the gesture but didn't comment, apparently accepting that her son had adopted this stranger as temporary family member. The main concourse was vast, vaulted ceiling arching high above to create sense of cathedral space, dedicated to the religion of constant movement. Seth's head tilted back to take it all in, eyes wide with wonder at architecture designed to make travelers feel both insignificant and important simultaneously. "It's like a palace," he breathed, apparently never having been in a space this grand. "Like where kings and queens would live if they were always leaving to go somewhere else." Carrie checked her phone with shaking hands, pulling up the message thread with her mother to confirm meeting location. "She said she'd be by the information kiosk," she reported, voice tight with tension that had been building throughout the journey, near the west exit. Her eyes scanned the crowd as if expecting her mother to materialize, as if the 6-year separation could be ended simply by making eye contact across a crowded station. "Do you want a minute?" Galliano asked quietly, recognizing Carrie's rising panic. "We could get coffee, let you settle yourself before you have to perform reunion for an audience." But even as he offered the delay, he saw Carrie's jaw set with determination, the same expression Seth had worn when declaring he'd tell his mother about hearing her cry. "No," she said firmly. "If I wait, I'll just get more nervous. Invent more scenarios for how this could go wrong. Better to just do it and know." They moved through the crowd as a unit, Galliano unconsciously positioning himself slightly behind and to the side, creating protective space that allowed Carrie and Seth to move without being jostled by other travelers. His awareness of threats and exits activated automatically, years of survival instinct kicking in, even though the danger here wasn't the kind he usually managed. The information kiosk appeared ahead, large digital board displaying arrivals and departures in constant scroll, and beneath it a small crowd of people holding signs, checking phones, waiting for loved ones. "I see her," Carrie said suddenly, voice strangled with emotion Galliano couldn't quite identify. Hope, fear, anger, longing, all compressed into 2 syllables. She stopped walking abruptly, causing Seth to stumble slightly before catching himself. "That's her, by the pillar, in the blue coat." Galliano followed her gaze to a woman who had to be in her late 50s, golden hair similar to Carrie's but streaked with gray, posture rigid with the kind of tension that suggested she was equally nervous about this reunion. Seth looked up at his mother, then toward his grandmother, then back at his mother, clearly waiting for guidance on how to proceed. "Do I go first?" he asked, apparently willing to be the advanced scout if that would make this easier. "Or do we go together?" Carrie knelt down to his eye level, hands on his shoulders, apparently needing to make sure he understood something important before they moved forward. "Together," she said firmly. "We're a team, remember? Whatever happens, we face it as a team." Seth nodded seriously, then surprised everyone by reaching out to include Galliano in their small huddle, one hand still holding his mother, while the other grabbed Galliano's coat. "Team of 3 right now," he corrected, apparently having expanded his definition of family to include the stranger who'd listened to his fears on a train, even if just for tonight. Galliano felt something crack completely in his chest, the final resistance to caring about these people dissolving under Seth's simple inclusion. He'd spent years building walls to prevent exactly this kind of vulnerability, this investment in others' happiness that could only lead to potential loss. But kneeling there in a train station with a child's hand clutching his coat, and a single mother about to face her estranged parent, he couldn't remember why those walls had seemed so important. "Team of 3, Galliano confirmed, voice rougher than intended, even if just for tonight. The repetition felt like vow, commitment that bound him to these strangers in ways he didn't fully understand but couldn't deny. Carrie's eyes met his over Seth's head, gratitude and something else. Recognition maybe that they'd all been changed by this accidental encounter, that they were walking toward whatever came next as different people than they'd been when they boarded the train. They stood together, straightening postures and gathering courage, preparing to bridge the gap between where they stood and where Carrie's mother waited. Seth kept one hand in his mother's, and one hand holding Galliano's coat, creating physical connection that announced they were unit rather than individuals. The grandmother had noticed them now, her face cycling through recognition, shock, and something that might have been longing or might have been dismay, too much distance to read accurately. Galliano found himself studying the grandmother's body language with the practiced assessment he usually reserved for potential threats or business negotiations, reading the subtle signals that revealed whether her presence was genuine desire for reconciliation or performance of family obligation. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white with tension that suggested genuine nervousness rather than casual interest in meeting them. She'd chosen to wear a blue coat that Galliano suspected was probably Carrie's favorite color based on how the younger woman's eyes had tracked to it immediately, small detail that suggested the mother had put thought into this reunion, had tried to communicate care through choices that might go unnoticed by anyone not looking for them. The overnight bag at her feet was small but expensive, leather that had been maintained carefully over years, the kind of possession someone kept because it held memory rather than just function. Seth noticed his grandmother's bag at the same moment and pointed with the unself-conscious directness of someone too young to understand that commenting on people's belongings could be considered rude. "Mommy has a bag like that," he announced to Galliano. "It was Grandma's before, from when Mommy was little. She uses it for work because it holds her stethoscope and the protein bars she eats instead of real lunch." The casual revelation that Carrie still used something her mother had given her years ago, that she'd kept this connection despite the estrangement, seemed to land on the older woman with visible impact. Her hand moved unconsciously to touch her own matching bag, apparently only now realizing that her daughter had maintained this small link between them even through years of silence, that some part of Carrie had been holding space for potential reconciliation all along. The walk across the station concourse felt endless, each step weighted with history and hope and fear of disappointment that had accumulated over 6 years of silence. Carrie's mother remained frozen by the pillar, apparently unable to move forward to meet them halfway, either from shock or uncertainty about her welcome. Up close, the family resemblance was unmistakable. Same bone structure, same golden hair, same eyes that had seen hardship and chosen either bitterness or resilience in response. The older woman's face showed evidence of the latter choice, lines of regret etched alongside signs of someone who'd done difficult internal work. "Mom," Carrie said when they were close enough for normal conversation, voice carefully neutral, giving nothing away about what she was feeling. "This is Seth, your grandson." The introduction was formal, almost clinical, as if presenting evidence rather than facilitating relationship. Seth, however, had no such reservations. He released both his mother's hand and Galliano's coat, stepping forward with the fearlessness that had served him well on the train. "Hi, Grandma," Seth said with genuine warmth, apparently deciding that his mother's caution didn't need to be his own burden. "I brought Captain to meet you too." He held up the worn rabbit, presenting it as if this were a natural part of any introduction. "He's been with me since I was born, so he's basically family too." The older woman's face crumpled slightly at this, eyes filling with tears she was clearly fighting to contain. "Hello, Seth," she managed, voice breaking on his name. You're so beautiful, both of you. I've missed so much." The admission came with visible pain, recognition of years she couldn't reclaim, moments she'd chosen to miss through her own stubbornness. Carrie's expression remained guarded, apparently not ready to absolve 6 years of abandonment with one emotional greeting. Galliano stood slightly back, witness to this reunion but not participant, the role he'd agreed to play. "This is Galliano," Seth announced, apparently taking charge of all introductions. "We met on the train because he was scared too, And now he's part of our team, at least for tonight. The older woman's eyes shifted to Galliano with confusion, clearly trying to place this expensive-suited stranger in her daughter's life. He's making sure we get here safe, Seth continued. And he told Mommy she's brave and that you'd be an idiot if you didn't love me. Galliano felt heat rise in his face at having his private comments repeated in public introduction to Carrie's mother, but the older woman's expression shifted to something approaching amusement, despite the emotional intensity of the moment. Well, she said, a small smile breaking through her tears. He's not wrong on either count. I have been an idiot. A proud, stubborn idiot who let principles and disappointment rob me of knowing my daughter and grandson. She looked directly at Carrie now. I'm sorry. I've been sorry for years but didn't know how to say it. Carrie's defensive posture softened infinitesimally, though her voice remained cautious. One apology doesn't erase 6 years, Mom, she said quietly. We needed you. I needed you. And you chose judgment over family. The hurt was raw in her words, unhealed wound being exposed to someone who'd caused it. I don't know if I can trust that you've actually changed or if you're just lonely and realized grandchildren are supposed to be part of your life story. Seth moved back to his mother's side, apparently sensing she needed support now that the initial greeting had passed. Mommy's scared you'll hurt her again, he explained to his grandmother with the blunt honesty children employed when adults were dancing around truth. And I'm scared you'll like me but not like Mommy, and then I'll have to pick. But Mommy says we're a team and nobody can split us up. So really you get both of us or neither of us. The older woman absorbed her grandson's assessment with visible pain, apparently recognizing the damage her past rejection had caused was being carried by a 6-year-old who shouldn't have to articulate these adult complexities. You're right to be scared, she said, addressing both Seth and Carrie. I hurt your mother terribly. I said things that can't be unsaid, made choices I can't undo. But I'm asking, not demanding, asking for a chance to do better, to know you both, to be family in the real sense, not just the biological technicality. Galliano watched this tentative reconciliation with awareness that he was witnessing something rare, genuine attempt at repair rather than performance of relationship. Both women were being honest about the hurt, while leaving door open for possible healing, modeling for Seth that relationships could be damaged, and sometimes, with work, repaired. It was healthier than anything he'd witnessed in his own family's history of scorched earth conflicts and permanent severances. We're staying at the hotel near the hospital, Carrie said finally, not committing to immediate forgiveness but offering pathway forward. Tomorrow morning we could have breakfast together, talk more when we're all less exhausted and emotional from traveling. The compromise was wise, creating opportunity for connection while maintaining boundary that allowed retreat if needed. Her mother's face showed relief and gratitude for even this small opening. I'd like that very much, the older woman said. There's a diner near the hospital. My treat. She hesitated, then added, and Galliano, you're welcome to join us if you're still in town. Anyone Seth considers part of his team has already proven themselves more than I have. The generous inclusion of a stranger revealed a woman genuinely trying to be different than she'd been, to honor her grandson's choices even when they confused her. Seth looked up at Galliano with hopeful expression that was both invitation and question. But before Galliano could formulate response, his phone vibrated with insistence that suggested emergency rather than routine business. He pulled it out to see multiple messages from his second-in-command. Situation requiring immediate attention. Decision that couldn't wait until morning. The kind of crisis that defined his usual existence. The contrast between the family tableau before him and the violent urgency in his messages was jarring. I have to go, Galliano said with genuine regret, recognizing that the spell of the train ride was broken, that reality was reasserting itself with its usual demands. Something at work that can't wait. He met Carrie's eyes, trying to communicate everything he couldn't say in present company, that this hour had mattered, that meeting them had cracked something open he'd thought was sealed permanently, that he wished he could stay, but his world didn't allow for breakfast with families and diners. Seth's face fell with disappointment that was quickly masked, apparently having learned early that adults often couldn't keep promises due to circumstances beyond their control. That's okay, he said with bravery that was clearly performance. Thank you for making sure we got here safe, for listening to my questions on the train, for telling Mommy she's brave. Each phrase was delivered like small gift, appreciation for kindness that might never be repeated. Carrie stepped forward, close enough that Galliano could see the exhaustion and hope and fear still battling in her expression. Thank you, she said simply, echoing her earlier gratitude but adding depth that came from reaching destination safely. For sitting with Seth instead of returning him immediately. For being honest about your life instead of pretending. For reminding me that strangers can sometimes see us more clearly than people who've known us forever. The words carried weight that suggested she understood what this encounter had cost him emotionally, what vulnerability he'd allowed that contradicted everything about his usual existence. Galliano wanted to say something profound, something that would capture what meeting them had meant, but words failed him. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. Simple, elegant, containing only a phone number with no name or business affiliation. "If you need anything," he said, pressing it into Carrie's hand. "If the reconciliation goes badly and you need somewhere safe to go, or if Seth has more questions that need answering, or if you just want to talk to someone who understands being scared, that number reaches me directly, anytime." Carrie's fingers closed around the card with pressure that suggested she recognized it as lifeline, backup plan, if her mother's promised change proved temporary. "I'll keep it," she promised. "Probably won't use it because I'm trying to learn to ask for help only from people who've signed up for long-term involvement, not strangers met on trains, but I'll keep it." The refusal was kind, realistic acknowledgement that their worlds didn't intersect in sustainable ways, but the keeping was its own form of hope. Seth stepped forward for a hug, apparently deciding physical goodbye was necessary regardless of whether they'd see each other again. Galliano knelt to the boy's level, accepting the embrace with awkwardness that came from years of not being hugged by anyone, let alone children who smelled like train travel and innocent trust. "Stay brave," Galliano said quietly, repeating words Seth's mother had apparently told him countless times. "Keep asking questions, especially the scary ones. Keep being part of your mom's team, and take care of Captain." "I will," Seth promised solemnly. "And maybe someday, if you stop being scared of remembering how to be human, you can find your own captain." Everyone needs something that reminds them what's important. The wisdom delivered in a child's voice landed with precision that suggested Seth understood far more than anyone gave him credit for, that his innocent questions on the train had been strategic in their own way, opening doors adults had learned to keep locked. Galliano stood, nodded to Carrie's mother, who was watching this entire interaction with visible confusion about what had transpired on the train to create this unlikely bond, and then turned to leave before he could change his mind about going. Each step away from them felt heavier than it should, as if he were walking away from possibility, rather than just returning to normal life. The crowd swallowed him quickly, anonymous traveler among thousands, but he felt their presence behind him like warmth against his back, until distance made it impossible. He was 3 blocks from the station, waiting for his driver to arrive, when his phone rang with Carrie's number. She must have called from a payphone since she'd mentioned not having much data on her plan. "Hello?" he answered, surprised by the contact so soon after departure. "Everything okay?" Her voice came through slightly breathless, as if she'd run to make the call. "I just wanted to say, before you went back to being whoever you are the rest of the time, that Seth was right. You're not just sad, you're lonely, and those are different things. Sad heals eventually, but lonely just gets worse unless you choose different." Galliano leaned against the building wall, closed his eyes, heard the truth in her assessment. "I know," he admitted. "I've known for a while, but knowing and choosing to change are different things, and changing requires vulnerability that doesn't work well with my actual life." The explanation was weak even to his own ears, excuse rather than reason. Carrie was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Seth thinks you're going to remember how to be human. He said it in the bathroom after you left, that you have the face of someone who's going to surprise himself. Kids are usually right about that stuff." "Your son is extraordinary," Galliano said, repeating his earlier assessment, "and you're brave in ways most people never manage. I hope your mother proves worthy of the chance you're giving her." More silence. Then Carrie's voice came through thick with emotion. "I hope you prove worthy of the chance Seth thinks you're giving yourself. That's all. Just wanted to say that before we become strangers again." She hung up before he could respond, leaving him standing on a cold street corner with a phone against his ear, and awareness that he'd been seen more completely in 1 hour by a child and his mother than he'd been seen in years by people who worked with him daily. His car arrived, sleek and black, and exactly the kind of vehicle someone in his position drove. The driver opened the door without speaking, trained to understand that Galliano didn't engage in casual conversation. But instead of climbing in immediately, Galliano stood on the sidewalk looking back toward the station he could no longer see, thinking about a boy in a lion hat asking if he was scared too, Thinking about a mother who chose honesty about her failures over protective pretense. Thinking about a worn rabbit named Captain who apparently carried concentrated wisdom about what mattered in life. Thank you all for following this story. If you're enjoying it, write in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support is important for me to continue bringing you stories like this. Sometimes the most profound changes in our lives begin with a simple question from someone brave enough to ask. Sometimes being found starts with admitting we're lost. And sometimes the person we most need to connect with is the version of ourselves we buried beneath years of survival and fear.